Welcome. I'm Giovanni Zanalda, the director of the Duke Center for International Global Studies and of the Rethinking Diplomacy program. Please join the Space Diplomacy Lab of the Duke University Center for International Global Studies program for a timely discussion with Professor Frans van der Dank on space diplomacy. And today we are going to have several members of our Space Diplomacy Lab in conversation with Professor van der Dank. And my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Schmidt, will introduce the speaker and will lead the discussion that will follow Professor van der Dank's initial remarks. And I would like to, first of all, to extend our thank you to Professor van der Dank for joining us, and also to all the attendees, and a particular thank you to a group of students and faculty at University of Padua who are connected with us as part of the Italian Diplomacy Spring School 2022, organized by University of Padua and other two Italian universities. Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you, Giovanni, and thank you everyone for coming this morning. I'm Benjamin Schmidt. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics and also co-founder with Giovanni of the Space Diplomacy Lab as a part of the Rethinking Diplomacy program at the Duke Center for International and Global Studies. So we had our launch event about 6 weeks ago, just about 48 hours after the start of hostilities of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And since then, and also before the conflict, we saw basically space becoming involved in some way or another in the discussion, whether it's through Russia's direct ascent anti-satellite weapons test back in November, or the role that the private sector has played. Maxar and Planet Labs certainly have had their space imagery, private sector, public facing space imagery in the headlines. Everything that we're looking at when we're looking at satellite imagery in the media comes from those firms. There's a few others as well. Capella, I think, is one as well. And we've also seen SpaceX's Starlink satellite become enabled in Ukraine to keep the information environment open. So there's a lot of these threads going on. The focus of our program, of course, is on the peaceful and sustainable use of outer space and an anticipatory diplomacy model where we're looking at what sort of regulatory and norm-setting processes, what sort of summits can we have? Ambassador Pearson and I have written about the need for a summit for space security in the near future, and this is the sort of thing that we want to focus on because there is such a proliferation of governments. Large and small nation states, not just the traditional old, one could say, space powers, as well as the private sector accessing low Earth orbit and beyond. So with all of these threads going on, there's obviously a large opening for space diplomacy, anticipatory diplomacy, and keeping in focus how do we make sure that going forward we have, the ability of the world to access the promise, both economically, socially, et cetera, of low Earth orbit and beyond, as we're going through this space renaissance of the next decade. So to discuss these sort of topics today, we're thrilled to be joined by Professor Dr. Frans van der Dank, who holds the Harvey and Susan Perlman Alumni and Othmer Chair of Space Law at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's program on Space and Telecommunications Law. He's also director of Black Holes BV, Consultancy in Space Law and Policy based in Leiden, the Netherlands. He's joining us from the Netherlands today. Van der Dank was awarded the Distinguished Service Award of the International Institute of Space Law of the International Astronautical Federation in Vancouver in October 2004, the Social Science Award of the International Academy of Astronautics in Valencia in October 2006, the Social Science Book Award of the International Academy of Astronautics in Jerusalem in October 2015. He was a signatory, together with various Nobel Prize winners, dozens of astronauts and cosmonauts, and other luminaries from the global science and entertainment community of the Asteroid 100X Declaration in December 2014. Following his studies in modern history and international law, he defended his dissertation on, quote, private enterprise and public interest in the European, quote, spacescape in 1998, certainly something that we're talking about these days. and published the first comprehensive handbook on space law with a foreword by Apollo 9 astronaut Rusty Schweigert in 2015, an advanced introduction to space law in 2020. As of 2006, he's the series editor of Studies in Space Law, published by Brill. Vanderdonk has written about 200 articles, and published papers, many of which can be accessed online, giving rise to hundreds of full text downloads monthly. He's given hundreds of presentations and has been a distinguished speaker at many universities, and we're so glad to have him here at Duke today. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Professor Vanderdonk to give opening remarks, and then we'll have just an informal discussion on these threads. So thank you. And Professor Vanderdonk, over to you.
Thank you. And just for confirmation, I hope everyone can hear me okay right now. Thank you for that lengthy introduction. And I apologize for taking so much time there, because I think there's more important things to talk about than about me. I thought I'd focus my introductory remarks on three issues. First, for the sake probably of also of the students who might not all be aware of what space law is all about, just a very few words on what space law is, and in particular on the Outer Space Treaty, which is a treaty going back to 1967, which still today serves as the heart and the framework of space law. Having said that, we should realize that this was drafted many years ago in a Cold War era, when basically the United States and the Soviet Union were the only powers really of any importance in space. And once they agreed on the text of the Outer Space Treaty, it just made sense for the rest of the world to go along with that. And by now, that treaty is indeed ratified by over 100 countries, which means that basically all the important spacefaring nations from all angles of the world are bound to that treaty. It does, however, have its limitations, which go back to the Cold War era, when, of course, the major fear was about the Cold War entering into a hot war phase. So some of its provisions try to limit the risk of a space war ever taking place in outer space. Nevertheless, the provisions there are quite general. There's one Article 4 which basically prohibits the stationing of weapons of mass destruction in outer space, and provides for a quite demilitarized regime for the moon and other celestial bodies. There's a reference to the UN Charter, which applies to outer space. So wars of aggression, which are obviously prohibited under the Charter, and of course, think about what's happening in Ukraine today, are equally prohibited to use any space technology or to make use of space. That's basically about it. And though there were a couple of follow-on treaties in space law developing some clauses in the Outer Space Treaty, there was a 1963 nuclear test ban treaty, which was also of major importance. Back in the days, it wasn't necessary to develop a very detailed regime on the possibility that armed conflict would break out in outer space. Basically, again, as long as the two superpowers agreed on rules of the road and how to behave properly in space, that should suffice and would suffice for preventing any armed conflict. Now, the second point is, of course, did it work? Well, it's certainly not the due only to the Outer Space Treaty, but we can safely argue that for the first half a century, space pretty much remained outside of any military conflict. There were many military uses of outer space, but they were all focused on reconnaissance or spying, as the popular term is, which, by the way, is not prohibited as long as you do it from outer space, because it's part of the freedom to do anything in space as long as it's not as such violating the UN Charter. So for many years, space indeed was a peaceful area, even though, of course, everyone knew that military satellites were doing a lot of reconnaissance over there, that the whole space race back in the 60s was to a large extent fueled by the military concerns of the United States versus Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. But it was pretty successful. As a matter of fact, in 1991, the Gulf War was hailed as the first proper space war. But even that's much of an overstatement, because the only use of space the only fundamental use of space in that context, apart again from the reconnaissance, was the use of satellite navigation for cruise missiles. So the conflict was very much down on Earth. Unfortunately, now things are going worse. Ben already referred to the Russian ASAT test. There was also an even more recent Indian ASAT test. There has been some strange Russian satellite maneuverings in the geostationary orbit. Of course, we've seen China and Russia building up their space forces, and France has done the same. And then just 2 years ago, the United States announced its own space force to be established. So unfortunately, chances of an actual conflict in outer space are growing. I would still say they are not very big, but they are at least maybe 3 times as big as I would have esteemed them like 10 years ago. So the third point is perhaps providing a little bit of a pointer of hope. And I want to discuss in a little bit more detail the role of the International Space Station in the context of the whole of the current developments. It may well be the canary in the coal mine, or perhaps the strongest canary in the coal mine, because to today it's still surviving. Of course, the space station finds its origins back in 1988, when then President Reagan proposed to build a space station with allies. It was called Freedom, as a clear political token to the enemy in the Cold War, the Soviet Union of days. But times were changing, and 10 years later, actually, Russia, after the Soviet Union fell apart, obviously the main inheritor of all the space infrastructure, hardware, knowledge, and expertise of the Soviet Union, Russia was invited to join. So since 1998, Russia, the United States, and 13 other Western countries have collaborated quite peacefully on board of the space station. And that international cooperation has survived the conflict in Georgia in 2008, which already gave rise to some sanctions. The conflict in the Crimea and the Donbass, which started in 2014. The Russian meddling with the US elections, or the poisoning of former Russian secret agents in Ukraine. So far, the ISS has, as an international cooperative effort, survived. We should realize that the ISS is currently consisting of 2 general parts. One is a Russian orbital segment, which consists of 6 modules, and the other is what is called the US orbital segment, consisting of 10 modules, of which at least 5 are European, and there's a Japanese one as well, so it's not strictly speaking US. They are tied together, they have access to each other, and they're still tied together, although if things really come to a bad place, it might probably be relatively easy to decouple them. But again, so far that is not happening. Yes, we've heard the threats of the director of Roscosmos that the Russians could one way or another threaten the existence of the space station and let it deorbit in a disastrous manner. Recently has kind of reiterated these kind of threats. My opinion is that that's mere posturing. First of all, as of course Elon Musk has taken a chance to pose as a savior by saying, well, if the Russians fail to keep the space station up in orbit, then I can do it. There are others who can do it as well. Northrop Grumman is working on a cargo vehicle, which should also have the possibility and the capability to push up the space station into its proper orbit if needed. So we are not that dependent upon the Russians as they would like to think. On the other hand, there are still Russians on board of the space stations as well. Actually, just 3 weeks ago, a new crew of 3 Russian cosmonauts launched towards the ISS. And 2 weeks later, when the Russians took back 2 of their own cosmonauts to the Kazakhstan steppes, the American astronaut Van der Heij, which, by the way, is a name originally coming from the Netherlands, so I can give you its real meaning, but that's, of course, beside the point here. They brought him back. He landed in Kazakhstan, and even though Kazakhstan is not the Soviet Union, it's not Russia, it's obviously within its sphere of influence, but the Russians didn't take any steps of trying to prevent Mark from being a day later rejoined with his family back in Houston. So what these threats are worth, I don't know. as a matter of fact, something like an hour from now, there is a commercial flight by Axiom flying 4 private Westerners to the space station again. So far, the canary in the coal mine is still alive. One good reason for that is mutual benefit. Both the Russians benefit enormously from the cooperation of the space station to the tune of earning hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And actually, on the Western side, that was one of the rationales for getting the Russians on board, to prevent these highly qualified and highly paid technicians from making it to even more suspicious countries. I think North Korea, think Iran, think Libya at the time. So there is a mutual benefit in keeping this going. And maybe the comparison is flawed in many respects, but it's a little bit similar like European dependence on Russian gas. We would like to punish the Russians by shutting off the gas coming from there, but we also hurt ourselves thereby. So it's an open question, I think, how long this will hold. I will stop there to allow for some time of discussion.
Great, thank you. That is giving us a lot to think about and talk about today. I think that we had a few prepared questions, and I'll go through a few of them and then open it up to Ambassador Pearson and Lindsay and Giovanni to ask further questions. But one of the first things that we wanted to ask you is really delving into your space law expertise and talking about this interplay between how the Outer Space Treaty or any other agreed protocols speak to the use of satellites designated as private or commercial that ultimately can also, effectively be dual use, providing information of use to military commanders, and what norms would you suggest to begin to address this issue? China will certainly follow our precedent, and could and should begin now to try to reach agreed rules of behavior. So I mentioned examples like SpaceX, Starlink satellites. They've been used both for keeping the information environment open, but also for communications that potentially include military communications and drone command and control. Maxar and Planet Labs have obviously had satellite imagery of the battle space, et cetera. So how do we unpack this, and how do we mitigate that for the peaceful and sustainable use of outer space in the future?
Yeah, that's also a lot of questions, very important and all interrelated questions. Let me start by saying that unfortunately there is no clear-cut answer yet to all these issues. While the Outer Space Treaty does speak to private satellites, in the term of art in the Outer Space Treaty is space object, but that certainly includes satellites. Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, one of the key articles, refers to operations by non-governmental entities, including any satellite operations. And following the Cold War reasoning of the time, in particular the Soviet Union, insisted on holding states fully responsible for private sector activities and the requirement to authorize and supervise them. The sort of flaw in all this was that the assumption / hope was that this would never actually erupt into military use by a private, involving a private satellite. And again, for many years, that hope was warranted and worked. So the idea was ultimately that the use of private operations in space would be purely for commercial and civil uses, and the problem of what would happen if they would not be used for civil and commercial purposes, but for military or even nefarious purposes, was kind of skirted, was kind of left aside, not to wake sleeping dogs, I'm almost tempted to say, and it is not touched, which means that we now have a problem now that we have to address potential use of satellites in a conflict, which makes them, of course, potential targets for the other side in the conflict, which basically is about, at a high level, the question of applicability of the law of armed conflict to outer space. In the law of armed conflict, we do have a lot of rules about objects which are part of the armed force operations of one party in the conflict, and what rights the other party has to attack that. The problem with all these rules is that they are always, or most of them, have developed very much on a domain-specific basis, either for land warfare or for warfare on seas. They have never been developed for space. Actually, as we speak, my university, a colleague of mine and I, Professor Jack Beard, are involved in an international effort called the Woomer Manual to try and summarize the state of the law as far as we can judge that it is applicable in terms of the use of outer space in the context of real armed force conflicts. Just to give you one example, under current space law, a satellite can never be equated to territory in a legal sense. It's at best something like quasi-territory. Think about a ship or a flag carrying a national flag. So the question is then, can an attack on satellite be simply equated to an attack on national territory, which might trigger the right of self-defense as per the UN Charter? And technically speaking, the answer is no. That doesn't mean that if your satellite is attacked, you are bereft of any possibilities to counterstrike, to take counteraction. But what are the limitations to a legitimate counteraction? Do we use classical LOAC concepts, law of armed conflict concepts, such as military necessity, discrimination, and proportionality? What if a satellite has 10 transponders and half of them are used for military purposes in a conflict, but the other half are used for serving hospitals or totally innocent, peaceful purposes? Is that proportional? Is that military necessity? Does that allow the satellite to be stricken? What if the other 5 transponders belong to another state than the opposing state in the military conflict, a neutral state? Can you still destroy the satellite, causing that damage to a neutral state? And then if you talk about physical counterstrikes, if you blow up the satellite, you cause a lot of space debris, which also triggers obligations vis-a-vis neutral third parties in outer space. So I think, to answer your last point, yes, we should be very careful in developing new rules and trying to limit the possibility to counteract as much as possible, because we can't criticize China if we start doing it ourselves. And we can't criticize China for attacking satellites in retaliation to perceived threats by US satellites if we do the same ourselves. So far, we've been doing a good job, I think, in doing that. But that is something very tricky. But unfortunately, there are no rules of the road yet, and we better develop them fast, because as everyone knows, once you have a conflict on your hands, people have vested interest in rules one way or the other, and it will be terribly difficult to then come to an agreement on an overarching legal regime.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we go to Ambassador Pearson, and then Lindsay. So, what conflict mitigation or humanitarian support uses? Can we go on mute? Sorry. So, I mean, we've seen heart-wrenching images out of Ukraine for weeks. So we want to talk about the humanitarian side of things. What conflict mitigation or humanitarian support uses of satellite information and imagery can you envisage here and possibly elsewhere? For example, identifying safe evacuation routes, possible ceasefire opportunities, positioning relief convoys or centers to meet refugees along the route, and maintaining secure communications networks among humanitarian relief agencies and the like, again, to support the humanitarian causes of refugees using these space assets?
Well, basically, the answer is across the whole range of activities that you mentioned, because space technology can really help on all of these. And actually, it is already doing so. Satellite technology has already shown, images have shown proof of mass graves, which unfortunately doesn't help the dead people in there, but at least might help some sense of justice afterwards. Has exposed other proof of war crimes of the Russian armed forces in Bucha, and may discover more. But in a more positive sense, you already pointed to Starlink, which as a private initiative can provide help to a population otherwise probably bereft of telecommunications, which is, of course, a first need if you want to find out where people need to be fed or need to be saved or need to run for shelter and things like that. And there is a lot of possibilities there. And for example, the European Union has started deploying, before there was a Ukrainian war in Ukraine, a number of years before already, has started deploying a Copernicus satellite system, multi-satellite system, which formerly was named Global Monitoring for the Environment and Security. So the last word already gives you the deal, which encompasses all these efforts to use satellite technology and satellite data for humanitarian purposes. At the time, it was more concerning refugees from other parts of the world, but obviously that can be used in Ukraine as well. And there are some general international law principles espoused by the UN Charter, in particular in case of aggression against the territorial integrity and the sovereign independence of a state, to use technologies, and states are probably even legally obliged to make them available to the extent necessary. It's interesting to note that since 1999, there is actually an international charter for space disasters, which is not strictly speaking a legal treaty, but which provides for an institutionalized and streamlined system for allowing access to and use of space data in any context of a natural or human-made disaster, and it has been invoked more than 600 times since. So it is clear that both the states and other stakeholders in space activities are very much aware of their potential contributions to humanitarian causes. And again, the offer by Starlink is just one most clear example thereof.
Great. Well, I have a few other questions, but I do want to go to our panel. So, Ambassador Pearson, I want to hand this over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate this opportunity, Dr. Van de Donk. I'd like to pursue the last issue just a little bit. So, in the rules of war on land, it would be illegal to attack a Red Cross center, a refugee center, a gathering of innocent civilians somewhere for whatever reason. They're supposed to be outside the permitted zone of a conflict. I realize that we're stuck with a problem with satellites that do both things. So and of course, wars precipitate questions onto us for which we're not prepared to give instant answers. I appreciate that too. Would there be a mechanism for identifying satellites that provide civilian and humanitarian support and use that as equivalents of those Red Cross centers or other refugee centers? Or perhaps to anticipate a later question, if a satellite provides information that shows that an evacuation route may be under risk because of a military movement of forces, is it not permitted to have that information shared with responsible authorities so as to preserve the evacuation route or the refugee center, something like that? So if you could tease out a little bit your thinking on that kind of question, that would be very helpful.
Okay, well, thank you for those questions. To start with the second one, it is certainly permissible. One of the what I would call beauties of space law to a certain extent is the baseline of freedom of activity. So if the operator feels, or the operator of the satellite feels that information is relevant to share with humanitarian organizations or with actual individuals on the ground, that is, first of all, their absolute right to do so. And second, going back to what I said before, given the general humanitarian obligations to not stand on the side of an aggressor and to do the utmost, within reason at least, to try and save human lives, et cetera, they could actually be considered to have a kind of obligation to share that with anyone who can actually alleviate the plight of these operators. Going back to your first question, one way of thinking about this is, for example, to come up. It's not there yet, unfortunately, because we as experts, unfortunately, cannot make the law at the international level. It's for the states to do that. But we can tell them that one way of doing that is making sure that there is at least an absolute prohibition on physically destroying the satellite, because then you, without discrimination, destroy not only, you may gain some military benefits from the military transponders on that satellite, but you also destroy a lot of civilian purposes. You talk about the equivalent to a Red Cross. Yes, you can certainly, just as you can prove that a Red Cross hospital is actually a Red Cross hospital, or to put it differently, unless you can prove differently, the assumption should be that it is used for the proper purposes. You can do the same, you can apply the same to space. And if you prohibit a physical destruction, also because of the onward possibility of space debris giving rise to further on damage, that may open the possibility to just jam the transponders that you have a problem with. The satellite can continue flying, the satellite can continue to serve hospitals and schools and other peaceful and totally inappropriate subjects of military attack, while the attacker can rest assured that the military applications, the military transmitters, are at least temporarily shut down. So the fact that that technologically is possible should make it easier for states to accept the rule that they don't need to take I hesitate to use the word, but the nuclear option of just destroying the whole satellite for the sake of 5 of the 10 transponders in my example. I hope that sort of answers your question.
Ambassador, you're done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van der Donk. I think that does address those issues, and I think that it will, of course, engender many more conversations about how to bring clarity to this and to related issues. So thank you very much for the response.
Great. I'll now turn to Lindsay.
Thank you so much. My question is a little bit more general to this conflict, as well as ongoing issues in space that exist beyond the current war with Ukraine and Russia. And it has to do with determining the responsible party when an object in space or a satellite is of unknown origin. So we see situations where debris items resulting from, say, a matter of conflict, or a debris that has been floating in space for years, you might not know who necessarily it belongs to. In these kind of situations, and as well within the context of the current high tensions that exist in space because of the ongoing conflict with Ukraine and Russia, what sort of legal avenues are available when there is some sort of catastrophic event where we really don't know who owned the aggressive satellite that caused the damage, or who was responsible for creating the debris that ended up diminishing services to multiple parties? Are there any sort of legal avenues for such a situation? And if not, what do we really need to do in order to have accountability?
Yeah, that's another great question. I would actually, at the risk of oversimplifying things, say there are basically 2 scenarios. One is where we should be most worried with, namely that an active satellite does something that creates a lot of devastation, whether it's in Ukraine or in another context of an armed conflict. Only active satellites are of real military use, because if you just have a piece of floating dead junk in outer space, it can do terrible things, certainly in outer space, or if it survives re-entry, even back on Earth. But that's no longer at the choice of whoever owned it. So the military use of that is very limited. It's just a shot in the dark, if you want to put it that way. So if you take the first example where you have operating satellites, then so far at least, the identification of the state behind that is relatively simple. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but to this day, it is still very difficult to launch anything in outer space without the current networks picking it up somehow and being able to pinpoint to some original launch site somewhere. There was the famous story back in the 1950s when the Soviet Union started launching, that they tried to trick the Americans by naming the launch base to a city which was actually 500 kilometers away from the real place of launch. But the satellites of the US quickly found out. And of course, now we are in an age with even, 10 or 100 times as capable surveillance technology. So until basically now, I'm pretty sure that is not easy. That is not easy to escape that. That may change with all the small satellites and the small launchers and stuff like that. But so far, we are in pretty known territory, which also means that you can pretty much find out the state behind something going on. The only shady thing may be an operator in a vague country, which actually is a veiled conduit for North Korean or Russian or some other state who doesn't want to be openly seen and develops a company in a poor small state somewhere else in the hope that it gets away with that. That's the only risk. That's the largest risk I currently see. The legal tool, to answer your real question, is clearly there because Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty simply prohibits the violation of international law by any satellite, private or public, and the state is responsible for that. So whether that leads to actual, results in the international community is another question. We all know that all states are equal, but some states are more equal than others. The bigger you are as a state, the more you can get away with, unfortunately, but that's reality. Now move to the other part. Yes, if there is space debris floating, in particular, if it's smaller space debris, which can still create huge damage in outer space. Paint flicks can pierce an astronaut's spacesuit if he is in an extravehicular activity, if he's doing a spacewalk outside of his vehicle. And in particular, also, if the originating event, the fragmentation event, is maybe years back, it's basically impossible to pinpoint back to whatever state or states were involved in the original collision in the original space object. If it would be able to point back, you can still trigger the liability rules, which mean that state has to pay for the damage. But again, then you have a major problem, which, interestingly enough, if you flip it upside down, causes everyone in outer space to be in the same boat. So that's why also the Russians will be careful in destroying a space object in outer space, because space debris doesn't discriminate. When they did their most recent ASAT test, they actually threatened the space station. They have these space sort of virtual space safety corridors. If something comes too close, everybody needs to get in the lifeboat. This happened. And 2 of the 6 people who need to get in a lifeboat were Russian cosmonauts. So if something bad would have happened to the space station, they also would have hit the same people. So there is this, in that sense, there is this commonality of interest to try and do something generally about space debris. But we're certainly not there yet.
Thank you so very much. That was a fantastic and a very thorough answer. I very appreciate it.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to some of the Q&A that we have from the audience. We've also seen the potential impact of Russia's aggression against Ukraine on the global food system. Obviously, Ukraine is a major wheat and grain supplier for the global community. We've also seen the use of for example, mining and damage of agricultural equipment in fields by the Russian military. So what is currently permissible in space law, and what needs to be changed to allow problems of this food security issue that we're seeing not just in Ukraine, but regionally and even globally, more squarely into the space law and space policy and space diplomacy matrix, and how can we, what sort of assets that are needed potentially or can be used today? I know that we've seen NASA's FIRMS satellite that can pinpoint fires on the ground and things like this be used in this way in recent weeks. But how do we do that going forward on a broader level?
Yes. Well, I'm happy to say that in terms of space law, you don't need to do much because, again, the baseline legal rule for outer space is freedom for all states. So if states are interested in providing information on how to best grow crops, on how to fight climate change, which is, of course, one of the major threats to food security in the world. If money going into space is spent on trying to create food which is more resistant against viruses. They do a lot of experiments like that on the space station. There's no rule prohibiting them to do that. So it's not the problem doesn't lie with space law, except perhaps to the extent that you could at some point start changing the freedom to do something into an obligation to do something. So, and then the obligation to share. In that sense, there might be something to be gained in space law in the sense of creating an obligation to share information that can help enhance food security down on Earth, whether it's in the Ukrainian situation or more generally. There are a few very general principles which kind of go a little bit in that direction, but they certainly don't go far enough. But I would say it's more a matter of not of space law, but of space policy and diplomacy and the willingness of states to actually make that happen, to spend the money as far as necessary, to use the satellites and to use the data. And again, going back to an earlier point, to share them with all those who on the ground could then make create useful benefits therefrom. I'm afraid that's where the potential contribution of space stops.
Okay, very, very interesting. I'm going to go to start going through some of the Q&As we're getting from the audience. Of course, other audience members, if you have other questions, please put them in the Q&A feature as we go forward for the next 20 minutes or so. The first comes from Charles Dunlap, who asks, the targetability of commercial satellites is an interesting topic, particularly when they become part of a, quote, open source intelligence operation. We've seen a lot of, I'll just editorials, we've seen a lot of OSINT Twitter accounts in the past few months around this conflict. So being part of this open source intelligence operation where the information is used to support specific military operations and for targeting belligerent military objects. What are the panel's thoughts about this? And by panel, I think he means you.
That was what I was afraid of. That's a very difficult question. I mean, the whole issue of open source information throws a lot of basic assumption with which international diplomacy and international law has worked for maybe centuries on a heap or upside down, because there may be a lot of information there that is of military use. Now, the usual reaction of states is to try to clamp down on that. There are many areas, for example, remote sensing, where the United States, to take one example, is very keen on allowing the private sector to undertake remote sensing operations because it is considered to the benefit of US economy and population, or more broadly speaking, to humankind as a whole, to allow the private sector to develop beneficial services. And of course, there are a range of very beneficial, positive uses of remote sensing. But the moment that these remote sensing data then provide risk to security, then of course another thing comes in, and the US authorities have legal tools to limit the operators, at least under their jurisdiction, from sharing sensitive information, sharing sensitive data. So what you probably might see happen, and of course the US can only go so far, they can only impose these requirements on US operators or operators operating from US territory or interested in serving the United States. If it's an operator which operates totally outside of the US, there's very little that they can legally do, either national, in terms of federal national law, or in terms of international law. And then it comes down to diplomacy and trying to convince that other country that they should do something to limit access to these data as well. And so far I've been talking about satellite data, but I could assume that a similar kind of general approach would start to be developed in the context of open source activities as well, that states would try to clamp down on them or limit access to them to the extent that they see their own specific security concerns being harmed. and will try to maybe create international coalitions with like-minded states to spread that approach as broadly as possible. Well, of course, every state has its own view on what is security sensitive, as you can imagine. So maybe that serves as a beginning of an answer, but I'm sure it's not the full answer.
Oh, that's really great. One more follow-up from Charles. Quote, why wouldn't the accepted proportionality analysis applicable to the many other dual-use objects apply to satellites?
Oh, yes. Well, let me be clear. I do think, and that's also the general feeling of the people working on the Woomera manual, that the proportionality analysis does apply to outer space. The question is, of course, is always, how does it apply in the particular context of space? It's easy on the ground. You can almost say a tank for a tank, or an aircraft for an aircraft, if you want to retaliate. But how does that work in space? If the United States has 60 satellites and North Korea would be able to cripple one of them, would it be proportional to cripple the maybe one satellite that North Koreans have up there, which is maybe their only platform to serve, apart from military aims, also civil aims? It's one-on-one on an absolute scale. But in the US case, the 1 out of 60 can reasonably, be taken care of by sort of repurposing some of the other 59. And the North Koreans might not have that possibility. It's a stark example, but just to draw out that proportionality as a principle is beautiful, and I'm certainly that it should be applied to space. But how do you apply it? How does it work? Is it proportional if your satellite is taken out of operation, and as a result you have an electricity problem down on Earth, with the result that some hospitals get endangered because they no longer have access to the normal energy that they are? Is it then allowed to proportionally, if you can't hit the satellite of another state of your opponent, to start an armed attack on the territory of that direct opponent, where maybe direct victims will suffer, people will die, whereas on your end it's at best an indirect effect of the satellite being harmed? So again, the concept applies, but all the proof of the pudding is in the eating, or I don't know which exact parable would be best to quote here, but you have to look at how it will work in practice to really thresh out all sorts of scenarios in order to come to grips with what proportionality would actually mean in any given case.
Great. So we don't have any more Q&A chat questions. I'm going to give a few seconds to Ambassador Pearson and Lindsay to get ready to ask one more round of questions. And while they do that, I will ask one of my own, which is to say that during the Cold War, we saw, this struggle, this new struggle to get information into authoritarian states, closed information systems, so into the Soviet Union. Right now, we're seeing that same sort of dynamic start to grow. There's been any number of articles written about how to get the truth about what's going on, the atrocities that are being perpetrated by the Russians on the ground in Ukraine to the Russian people, so that they understand what's going on in an open environment, information environment sense. And so the Soviet era, Cold War era analog from the West was Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Is there a space equivalent of that we can think about? Obviously, Starlink has been used to keep the information environment open for Ukrainians because of Russian targeting of civil communications networks in Ukraine. What about going behind the new Iron Curtain and getting that sort of information environment opened up using space? And are there space law restrictions on that?
There basically are no space law restrictions on that, as long as you, in terms of the communication devices, first of all, I should again point out space is free for activities, which means that as long as you stay outside of Russian airspace with your satellite, so, to put a sort of informal altitude, as long as you overfly Russian or Ukrainian territory at altitudes of 150 kilometers or more, nobody will dispute that that is in outer space, which is a free area. If you get a little bit lower, you may get into some disputes. There's an informal discussion that maybe 100 kilometers is the actual borderline, but let's not go there. So that's the first step. The second step is that you are able to broadcast anything as long as you comply in technical and operational terms, and that basically talks about frequencies, with the ITU international coordination process. The ITU is the International Telecommunications Union, part of the UN family of organizations, and every use of an international frequency or a radio frequency which has international consequences has to go through the ITU. So if you properly coordinated your use, and in the case of Starlink, for example, that has been done, you can do whatever you want. So that is indeed the equivalent of Radio Free Europe. Radio Free Europe was limited by having to stay outside of Soviet territory, and including territorial waters, which meant that they had probably to go for long-range frequencies, take care of the curvature of the Earth, because of course the Russian territory is so huge that makes a difference. You have to have the right power levels. From outer space, it's not that different. So actually, in that sense, it's much more easy to do. The problem is, of course, that once you start doing that, and that has happened before, is that the state targeted by such free Europe, free radio broadcasts can, of course, as part of their own sovereignty, make laws that prohibit the reception thereof by its population, and if necessary, impose heavy penalties, and B, can do technologically whatever it can to actually detect people still secretly pointing their satellite antenna to Starlink satellites. So that's the issue. It makes me think, not that I was alive at the time, but of the Dutch occupation by the Nazis in the Second World War, when we were, of course, prohibited from, once we were occupied, from listening to Radio Free Orange in London, which gave us the truth about the war, because the Germans, the Nazis, didn't want us to listen to us. Of course, they couldn't prevent the broadcasts, but they paid, people who were found having a radio secretly listening could be shot to death. So that was kind of the way they can try to control. And I'm afraid something similar may soon happen in Russia as well. Whether that is sufficient to keep individual Russians from still having access, of course, it's much more sophisticated than simply having a radio, more sophisticated on both sides of the fence. I don't know, but that's kind of where we are at, I think.
Got it. I'm going to go to Lindsay and then Ambassador Pearson, and then we'll get final comments from Professor van der Donk. So, Lindsay.
All right. I'm going to ask a little bit of a kind of a closing out question. So I know that this conflict between Ukraine and Russia has highlighted a lot of issues within space diplomacy that currently have been underutilized and also received too little attention. And so we're scrambling now in the midst of conflict to figure out what systems do we need in place to ensure that these kind of gaps in knowledge and protocol don't happen again and catch us by surprise. So I'd like to ask, from a space law perspective, what has this conflict, in your opinion, shown is like the biggest hole in our space legal system? What do you think is the issue that moving forward beyond this conflict, we really need to work together as an international community to address, to ensure that those types of gaps in protocol, in systems and infrastructures don't catch us by surprise again?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I'm afraid I have to sort of hark back to what I said before. The principles are there, the foundation work is there. We didn't need to go much further. We've been lucky that we didn't need to go much further for maybe the first 60 years after the initiation of the Outer Space Treaty. What we should do is probably just build on them and make the obligations to actually use space in the service of mankind, humankind, I should say, and peace, more more obligatory, more mandatory, and less of a high moral principle which states can, acknowledge and abide by if it suits their purposes and ignore if it doesn't come in handy. The major problem with making that happen is, of course, that again, we're down to international law. International law requires, certainly when it comes to space, that at least the major players in space can agree to that. And very unfortunately, I want to say, if it would be only Russia, that would already be bad enough. But if Russia would be isolated, you could at least achieve a kind of consensus among the rest of the world. But if I look beyond the West, I'm afraid that China is suspiciously on the fence. They will never, at this moment, I think, sign up to anything which is clearly targeting to take away steam from the Russian invasion and trying to prove all the war crimes, etc., etc. I'm a little bit disappointed that even India is rather seeing this as a chance instead of a nuisance, and is trying to probably become the client for Russian oil and gas that Europe now tries to shy away from. And India is a major space player as well. So if you would now organize a conference, even without Russia, of all the major spacefaring countries, I'm afraid that you won't be able to come to any sort of concession there. So it might be, on paper, it might be relatively easy, but I'm afraid political reality dictates otherwise currently. I'm sorry.
Well, there's challenges for our Summit for Space Security that Ambassador Pearson and I wrote about. And with that in mind, Ambassador Pearson, your final questions here.
Thank you very much, Ben. Dr. Van der Dunk, an analogy to climate change. In our Rethinking Diplomacy program, our anticipatory diplomacy, we are trying to work on how to look over the horizon. So with climate change now, we're almost past knowing what the impacts are. And now we're trying to decide what the impacts of the impacts will be. So one of the chief motivators for climate change urgency now is the population of the Earth begins to realize what the consequences just will be, not even might be. How would we be able to move forward to show the world's population the benefits of space and the risk of space in such a way as to get them invested in the outcomes, so that governments feel that pressure and nations feel the opportunity to do something about the problems facing us?
The best direct way, I think, is involve as many astronauts and cosmonauts as you can. Because all of them, at least all of them I met, which are 24 or more, and then all the others I read about, they came back from space with an enormous sense of awe for the vulnerability of the planet. The icon which started the whole ecological movement is still this picture of Earthrise by Bill Anders from the Apollo 8 program. These astronauts come back with an incredible sense of urgency that this is really, spaceship Earth, and we are the crew, and we are treating our spaceship, which is our only thing so far we have, pretty badly. And since astronauts and cosmonauts still carry a lot of the glamour and the public, clamor and fame of the phenomenal thing of going into outer space. And I'm not talking about the billionaires who are just doing a far pissing race. I'm talking about the real astronauts. They have this feeling, and some of them, they would, in their perfect world, they would be able to send everyone on a trip to outer space to see the Earth from the outside for the exact same reason. Now, obviously, A, that might risk the environment even more than it does, and B, it's certainly not possible anyway. But that is something that I see as a concrete way of using to your benefit the enormous popularity and glamour that these people still exude, including, luckily now, a number of women. Of course, it used to be an all-male club, but Nicole Stott, for example, wrote a great book on translating her view from outer space into what we can do on Earth to fight climate change and things like that.
Thank you. That's a very creative idea, and I think we'll try to see how we might be able to make use of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Professor Vanderdonk, I know that both Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos were clamoring to get those commercial aviation astronaut wings. So I hope they weren't listening today. But we tend to agree on that. A whole new meaning to the word plutocrat, as I've been saying. So thank you so much. We do want to give you the last word here. So with the context of the obviously large role of space and space law and space policy and space diplomacy that we're seeing in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine over the last 6 or 7 weeks and continuing, and then our broader focus on how to mitigate risks, build space norms, build confidence for a future that we're seeing that has an increasing number of nation state players and commercial sector players in space. With that in mind, any closing thoughts that you have would be very, very well.
Yeah. Well, at the risk of, otherwise I might risk starting talking for another half an hour, and that's certainly not the idea here. So let me just basically reiterate what I already said before, that we are, if we can get across the idea with everyone who is, who has some important position in society, that indeed Earth is the only spaceship we have, and we should see ourselves as its crew rather than its passengers who can freely benefit from the snack table without worrying where all the snacks come from. That is a mentality change that will take a lot of time. Unfortunately, of course, the current day and age is going not exactly in the right direction. And I can only hope that this is kind of an, like all of humankind's progress, is an Achternack procession where we do 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, or whatever it was. And that we are unfortunately now in one of the steps backward. But that hopefully in the not too far future, we will be able to take some steps forward again. But we'll see. Thank you very much for inviting me and for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Vanderdonk. Inspiring words as ever to close out a Friday discussion on the role of space in the conflict, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of broader peaceful and sustainable use of outer space in the next 10 years plus of this space renaissance that we are finding ourselves in. So thank you so much. And I'll just close by, again, saying what I said at the last event that we had. Given what we're seeing every day in Ukraine, please consider speaking to representatives, keeping the Ukrainians in your mind, and also giving to causes that support Ukraine. It's so vital at this time. But until next time, we will continue looking at all of these space law, regulatory norms, policy, and of course diplomacy issues. This has been an event of the Space Diplomacy Lab of the Duke University Center for Global International Studies, Rethinking Diplomacy program. And until we meet again, as I say each time, keep looking up. Thank you.